The wind moved through the barren gardens of Thornfield Manor like a whispered elegy, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, and in the fading light of late autumn, the great stone edifice stood against the darkening sky like a monument to sorrow itself. The manor had once been the jewel of the county, its ballrooms alive with music and laughter, its gardens bursting with roses that seemed to bloom in defiance of the northern climate. But those days had passed into memory, leaving behind only the shell of grandeur windows that stared blankly across the moors, corridors that echoed with emptiness, and rooms shrouded in holland covers like corpses awaiting burial. Within the manor's cold embrace resided its master, Adrian Blackwood, 5th Duke of Thornfield, a man of 30 years whose heart had calcified into something harder and more unyielding than the stone walls that surrounded him. The servants spoke of him in hushed voices, calling him the Silent Duke, for he moved through his ancestral home like a spectre, his footsteps barely audible on the marble floors, his presence announced only by the chill that seemed to follow him from room to room. He was a handsome man still, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and eyes of such pale grey they appeared almost colourless in certain lights, but his face bore the severe lines of one who had long ago forgotten how to smile, and there was a remoteness in his gaze that discouraged even the boldest from attempting conversation. On this particular evening, he sat in his study, a room panelled in dark oak and lined with leather-bound volumes that no one ever read, the fire in the hearth burning low despite the encroaching cold, for Adrian Blackwood seemed not to notice temperature or comfort, or any of the small pleasures that made life bearable. Before him on the massive desk lay correspondence from his steward, matters requiring his attention, decisions that affected hundreds of tenants and servants, but his mind wandered from the neat columns of figures to the rain-streaked window and the darkness beyond. He had built this isolation carefully, brick by brick, word by word withheld, constructing around himself a fortress that no one could penetrate, and he told himself it was necessary, this terrible solitude, for the alternative was vulnerability, and vulnerability led only to betrayal and humiliation, and a pain so exquisite he could not bear to risk it again. The late Duchess Cassandra had taught him that lesson with brutal efficiency, and he had learned it well, perhaps too well, for now he could no longer distinguish between self-protection and self-destruction, between guarding his heart and entombing it alive. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let's begin. 60 miles to the south, in a manor house far more modest than Thornfield, but filled with considerably more warmth, Eleanor Ashworth sat at her pianoforte in the morning room, her slender fingers moving across the ivory keys with the unconscious grace of long practice, coaxing from the instrument a melody both melancholic and hopeful, a Schubert piece her late mother had loved. She was 22 years old, possessed of a gentle beauty that revealed itself slowly rather than striking the eye, immediately soft brown hair that caught golden lights in the sun, eyes of warm hazel that reflected her emotions with transparent honesty, and a face that bore the sweetness of one who had known love and still believed in its possibility, despite the evidence gathering against such faith. Music was Eleanor's refuge and her passion, the language through which she expressed what words could not capture, and she had harbored dreams, foolish perhaps but cherished nonetheless, of a marriage built on affection and mutual regard, of a home filled with children and laughter, and the small domestic joys her parents had shared before her mother's death 3 years prior. Those dreams now lay in ruins at her feet, shattered by her father's trembling voice as he explained the situation that very morning, the failed investments, the mounting debts, the threat of losing their home, and what little remained of their respectability, and the solution that had presented itself in the form of a letter from the Duke of Thornfield's solicitors. Sir Robert Ashworth was not a bad man, merely a weak one, a baronet who had never quite mastered the art of managing money or facing unpleasant truths, and as he stood before his daughter in his study, unable to meet her eyes, explaining that the Duke sought a wife of suitable breeding and was willing to settle all their debts in exchange for her hand, Eleanor felt her heart contract with a pain that was both sharp and strangely familiar, as though she had been preparing for this moment all her life. She knew of the Duke, of course, for his reputation had spread throughout the county like frost across a window pane, the silent Duke who had lost his first wife to scandal and consumption, who had retreated into Thornfield Manor and emerged only for the most essential business, who was said to possess a fortune as vast as his coldness was profound. Her father spoke of duty, of family obligation, of the security such a match would provide, but Eleanor heard beneath his words the desperation of a drowning man grasping at the only rope within reach, even if that rope was made of thorns, and she understood, with terrible clarity, that she had no choice, not really, for to refuse would be to condemn her father to debtor's prison and herself to a fate potentially far worse than a loveless marriage to a duke. She allowed the music to fade, her hands falling still upon the keys, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears that blurred her vision, accepting the arrangement with the quiet dignity that was her particular grace, even as her heart whispered its protest against a future stretching before her like a winter road, cold and endless, and devoid of the warmth she had so longed to find. The wedding took place on a grey December morning, when the sky hung low and heavy over the ancient chapel at Thornfield, threatening snow that never quite fell, and Eleanor stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her mother, feeling as though she were attending her own funeral rather than her wedding, for the man beside her might as well have been carved from marble for all the warmth he displayed. Adrian Blackwood spoke his vows in a voice devoid of inflection, his pale grey eyes fixed on some point beyond the altar rather than on his bride, and when the moment came to place the ring upon her finger, his touch was so brief and impersonal it might have been a stranger performing a distasteful duty rather than a husband claiming his wife. Eleanor's own voice trembled as she repeated the sacred words that bound her life to his, and she searched his face desperately for some sign of the man beneath the ice, some flicker of emotion or acknowledgement that this moment held significance beyond legal contract, but she found nothing, only that terrible blankness that seemed to deny her very existence. The wedding breakfast that followed was an exercise in excruciating formality, held in Thornfield's grand dining room, where footmen moved silently between the handful of guests, her father, pale and nervous, avoiding her eyes, the Duke's solicitor, a few distant relatives who had come out of obligation rather than affection, and the palpable absence of joy or celebration that should have marked such an occasion. Adrian sat at the head of the table, responding to the requisite toasts with the barest nods, eating nothing, drinking less, his entire bearing radiating a coldness that seemed to lower the temperature of the room itself, and when Eleanor attempted to catch his eye, hoping for some private moment of connection, he turned his head away as though she had not spoken, as though she were invisible. The interminable meal finally ended, and as the winter afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor found herself being led by the housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, through the vast corridors of Thornfield, to the Duchess's chambers, rooms that had been hastily prepared for her arrival, and she understood from the elderly woman's kind but pitying expression that this was to be her domain, separate and distant from the Duke's own apartments in the East Wing. Dinner was brought to her on a tray, for Adrian had retreated immediately to his study after the guests departed, offering no explanation, no farewell, not even a glance in her direction, and Eleanor sat alone in the ornate bedroom that was now hers, surrounded by furniture that had belonged to the first Duchess, wearing a nightgown meant for a wedding night that would not occur, and finally allowed herself to weep. She cried for her lost dreams, for the loneliness that stretched before her like an endless winter, for the realization that she had sold herself into a prison more isolating than any stone walls could create. But as the tears subsided and the fire burned low in the grate, Eleanor felt something harden within her, a core of resilience she had not known she possessed, and she made a silent vow that she would endure this, she would maintain her dignity, she would find some way to make a life within these cold walls, even if that life bore no resemblance to the one she had imagined, for she was the Duchess of Thornfield now, and she would not allow this man's cruelty to destroy her completely. The days that followed the wedding settled into a pattern of such profound isolation that Eleanor sometimes wondered if she had become a ghost haunting Thornfield's corridors, visible only to the servants who curtsied nervously when they encountered her, invisible to the one person whose acknowledgement she craved, despite herself. Adrian maintained his silence as though it were a sacred vow, taking his meals in his study or the library, arranging his schedule so that their paths crossed as infrequently as possible, and when chance brought them face to face in some hallway or on the grand staircase, He would offer the briefest of nods before turning away, his expression as impenetrable as the manor's ancient stone walls. Eleanor tried, in those early weeks, to breach the distance between them, attempting conversation over breakfast when she rose early enough to intercept him, commenting on the weather or the estate or anything that might elicit more than monosyllabic responses. But her efforts were met with such cold dismissal that she soon abandoned them, her dignity refusing to allow her to beg for scraps of human interaction from a man who seemed determined to deny her existence. The servants moved through the house with uncomfortable awareness of the situation, their eyes downcast when Eleanor appeared, their whispers falling silent when she drew near. And she understood that she had become an object of pity, the young duchess trapped in a marriage that was hardly a marriage at all, bound to a man who treated her with less warmth than he showed his horse or his hounds. It was during one of her solitary wanderings through Thornfield's endless rooms, desperate for some occupation to fill the hollow hours, that Eleanor discovered the music room on the second floor of the south wing, a large chamber with tall windows overlooking the Winterbear Gardens and a magnificent pianoforte standing silent beneath a covering of dust. The room had clearly been abandoned for years, sheets draped over furniture, cobwebs strung like lace across the corners, the air holding that particular staleness of spaces long forgotten. But Eleanor felt something wake within her at the sight of that instrument, a spark of hope that she might reclaim some small piece of herself even in this prison of her husband's making. She spent the afternoon cleaning the room herself, refusing the servants' offers of help, needing the physical labor to occupy hands that longed to strike piano keys, and when she finally sat down at the instrument and lifted the lid, her fingers trembling as they found the familiar positions, the sound that emerged was slightly out of tune, but achingly beautiful, filling the empty room and the emptier spaces of her heart with something that resembled comfort. From that day forward, Eleanor retreated to the music room each afternoon, playing for hours, losing herself in Mozart and Beethoven and Bach, the composers becoming her only companions in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. And though she did not know it, could not have known it, her music carried through the walls and corridors of Thornfield, reaching ears that refused to acknowledge her presence, but could not entirely shut out the sound of her loneliness, transformed into melody. Eleanor's life at Thornfield settled into a rhythm born of necessity rather than contentment, her days structured around routines that gave shape to the emptiness her marriage had become. And each morning she would wake before dawn to walk the frost-covered gardens alone, her breath clouding in the winter air as she moved through the bare rose beds and past the frozen fountain, finding in the solitude something that resembled peace, or at least the absence of active pain. The afternoons belonged to the music room, those precious hours when she could lose herself entirely in the language of melody and harmony, her fingers dancing across the piano keys with increasing confidence as the instrument became an extension of her own voice, speaking all the words her husband refused to hear, and she progressed from the simple pieces of her girlhood to more complex compositions that demanded her complete attention, leaving no room for the loneliness that waited at the edges of her consciousness. Dinners she took alone in the small dining room adjoining her chambers, the formal dining hall having become a space she avoided, its grandeur only emphasizing the hollowness of her position, and she would read while she ate, losing herself in novels that promised happy endings she no longer believed possible for herself. But what Eleanor did not know, could not have known, was that Adrian watched her from the windows of his study, his eyes following her progress through the gardens each morning, observing the straightness of her spine and the deliberate placement of each step, seeing in her solitary walks a dignity that both shamed and fascinated him. He told himself his vigilance was merely the duty of ensuring his wife's safety on the icy paths, but in the darkest hours of night when sleep eluded him, Adrian was forced to confront the truth that he was drawn to her despite his determination to remain distant, that something in her quiet strength called to the parts of himself he had buried beneath years of bitterness and rage. The memories came unbidden in those wakeful hours, images of Cassandra that still had the power to wound even after 3 years in her grave, his first wife who had been all golden beauty and sparkling charm when they wed, who had captivated London society with her wit and grace, and who had revealed her true nature only after the wedding vows were spoken and she had secured her position as Duchess. Adrian could still hear her mocking laughter echoing through these very halls, still see the contempt in her eyes when she looked at him, still feel the searing humiliation of discovering her affair with his own cousin, carried on so brazenly that the servants knew before he did, and the worst moment, the one that haunted him still, had been the night he confronted her and she had laughed in his face, telling him that she had married him for his title and his fortune, but could never love a man so cold, so unfeeling, so fundamentally unworthy of genuine affection. She had thrown his attempts at tenderness back at him like weapons, mocking every vulnerable word he had spoken, every gesture of love he had offered, until he had learned to feel nothing at all, and to encase his heart in ice so thick that no one could ever reach it again. And when Cassandra had died in a riding accident while racing to meet her lover, Adrian had felt only a grim relief that his humiliation might finally end. He had vowed then never to allow another woman close enough to wound him, never to expose himself to that particular agony again. And when his solicitor had presented the arrangement with Eleanor Ashworth, a marriage of convenience to secure an heir and nothing more, Adrian had agreed with the conviction that he was protecting himself, that his cruelty to Eleanor was justified self-preservation, that keeping her at a distance was the only way to ensure he would never again experience the soul-destroying pain Cassandra had inflicted. But watching Eleanor now through the frost-patterned glass, seeing her pause beside the frozen fountain to look up at the grey sky with an expression of such profound sadness that it pierced even his carefully constructed armor, Adrian felt something shift within him, a hairline crack in the ice he had built around his heart, and he turned away from the window with hands that trembled slightly, telling himself it meant nothing, that it changed nothing, even as he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that Eleanor Ashworth was not Cassandra, and his punishment of her for his first wife's sins was a cruelty that might ultimately destroy them both. The months passed with the slow inevitability of winter frost creeping across glass, and Eleanor felt the weight of her isolation settle into her bones, manifesting in the hollow of her cheeks and the shadows beneath her eyes, her figure growing thinner despite the richness of Thornfield's kitchens. But she maintained her dignity with a fierceness that surprised even herself, holding her head high when she moved through the manor's corridors, refusing to let the servants see how their pitying glances wounded her, and it was Mrs. Brennan, the elderly housekeeper who had served at Thornfield for 40 years, who became Eleanor's unexpected ally. The older woman beginning to linger when she brought Eleanor's tea, making small observations about the weather or the estate that gradually evolved into longer conversations. Mrs. Brennan never spoke directly of the Duke's coldness, but she would make careful remarks about his first marriage, how Cassandra had been beautiful as a painting and just as cold, how the whole household had witnessed the systematic destruction of a good man's faith in love, and Eleanor understood that the housekeeper was offering her a gift, the context that might help her comprehend the walls her husband had built, though understanding did not make living behind those walls any easier to bear. The idea came to Eleanor one evening as she sat alone at dinner, the absurdity of her situation striking her with renewed force, that she and Adrian lived under the same roof, bore the same name, and were bound by law and church to one another, yet conducted their lives as strangers might, and she realized that if she did not act, if she did not force some acknowledgement of their shared existence, years might pass in this frozen state, and so the next morning she sought out Adrian in his study, her heart pounding as she knocked on the heavy oak door, and when his gruff voice bid her enter, she found him behind his massive desk, papers spread before him, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness at her unexpected appearance. Eleanor kept her voice steady as she made her request, explaining that while she understood his preference for privacy, surely they must maintain certain appearances for the sake of the estate and their positions in society, and would he not agree that dining together once weekly would be appropriate, a small concession to propriety that would quiet the servants' gossip and present a united front to the world beyond Thornfield's walls. And she watched the war play out across his features, the desire to refuse warring with his ingrained sense of duty and appearance, until finally, after a silence that stretched so long, Eleanor thought she might shatter from the tension, Adrian gave a single, stiff nod of assent. Their first dinner together the following Thursday was an exercise in exquisite discomfort. Eleanor in her finest gown at one end of the long dining table, Adrian in formal evening dress at the other, the distance between them, both physical and metaphorical, and they ate in absolute silence, broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain and the soft footfalls of servants who served each course with obvious nervousness, but Eleanor counted it as a victory nonetheless. This forced acknowledgement of her existence, this small breach in the fortress of Adrian's isolation, and when she retired to her chambers that evening, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, with patience and persistence, she might yet find a way to reach the man who had bound himself to her in name but refused her in every other way, though she could not have known then how many silent Thursday dinners would pass before the walls between them finally began to crack. Winter descended upon Thornfield Manor with a finality that matched the coldness of Eleanor's marriage, the grounds transforming into a landscape of white silence, where even the bare trees seemed to hold their breath against the bitter wind. And it was during one of their Thursday dinners, now in their third month of awkward regularity, that Eleanor realized with a certainty that sent both joy and dread flooding through her veins that she was with child. The signs unmistakable to a woman who had helped tend her married sisters through their confinements, and she spent the following week in a state of suspended animation, uncertain how to share this news with a husband who barely acknowledged her existence, yet knowing that duty demanded she inform him of the heir he had married her to provide. When the next Thursday arrived, Eleanor dressed with particular care, her hands trembling as her maid fastened the buttons of her gown, and she descended to the dining room with her heart hammering against her ribs, taking her customary seat at the far end of the table and waiting until the first course had been served and the footman had withdrawn before she spoke, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions within her, as she said simply, formally, that she had news of importance to share, that the physicians had confirmed she was expecting a child, and that an heir to Thornfield would arrive in early summer. Eleanor watched Adrian's face as comprehension dawned, saw the shock that flickered across his features like lightning illuminating a dark sky, his fork freezing halfway to his mouth and his grey eyes widening before his expression shuttered once more, returning to the impassive mask he wore like armor, and after a moment that stretched into eternity, he gave a single, curt nod, set down his utensils with deliberate precision, rose from his seat, and left the dining room without a word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more final than if he had slammed it. Eleanor sat alone at the table, the untouched courses growing cold before her, and felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over, running silently down her cheeks as she placed one hand over her still flat stomach, and in that moment she experienced the full complexity of her situation, the fierce, immediate love she felt for the tiny life growing within her, warring with the profound grief that this child would be born into a house without warmth, that she would raise her son or daughter, surrounded by wealth and privilege, but bereft of the one thing Eleanor had always believed essential, a father's love and a mother's happiness intertwined. In the days that followed, Eleanor found herself speaking aloud to the child when she was alone, her hands resting on her belly as she walked through the winter gardens or sat in the music room, telling her baby about the world that awaited, about the beauty of spring flowers and summer sunshine, about music and laughter, and all the joy she would somehow, impossibly, find a way to provide, despite the coldness that permeated Thornfield's halls. And it was during one of these solitary moments that Eleanor began to sing, her voice soft at first, tentative, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her in childhood, and she found in the act of singing something that prayer had failed to provide, a sense of connection and purpose, a way to pour all her frustrated love into something that mattered. And from that day forward, singing to her unborn child became Eleanor's refuge, the one pure thing in a marriage that had given her nothing else. As winter deepened and Eleanor's pregnancy progressed through its early months into the visible evidence of new life, she found herself drawn ever more frequently to the music room, that sanctuary of polished wood and ivory keys, where the afternoon light slanted through tall windows and illuminated the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. And it was here that she spent the greater portion of her days, her fingers moving across the pianoforte with increasing confidence as she relearned the pieces she had loved in her girlhood. But more than playing, Eleanor sang, her voice growing stronger with each passing week as she poured into melody all the love she could not express in any other way, the lullabies flowing from her lips like prayers offered to the small life growing beneath her heart. The songs became her conversation with the child, her way of speaking all the things she longed to say, promises of devotion and protection, assurances that though this baby would be born into a cold house, it would never lack for a mother's warmth. And Eleanor would rest her hands on her gradually rounding belly as she sang, feeling sometimes the flutter of movement that the physicians told her was merely her imagination, so early in her confinement, but which she chose to believe was her baby responding to the sound of her voice, acknowledging the bond between them that needed no words to be profound. What Eleanor did not know, could not have suspected in her isolation, was that her voice had found another listener, that Adrian had developed the habit of finding himself in the corridor outside the music room during the hours of her singing. Drawn there by a compulsion he could neither explain nor resist, and he would stand in the shadows with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, letting the sound wash over him like a tide that threatened to erode the careful fortifications he had built around his heart. And in those stolen moments of listening, Adrian felt something shifting within him, a dangerous softening, a crack in the ice that he both longed for and feared with equal intensity. The music haunted him in ways he had not anticipated, following him into his study, where he could no longer focus on estate business, into his bedchamber, where sleep eluded him, and he lay staring at the ceiling while Eleanor's voice echoed in his memory, and he found himself tormented by images of her alone in that music room, singing to their child with a tenderness he had never known, offering their baby everything he had denied her, love and warmth and the promise of happiness. And the contrast between Eleanor's gentle devotion and his own cruel coldness began to work upon him like water upon stone, slowly, inexorably wearing away at his conviction that isolation was safety, that refusing to feel was the same as refusing to be hurt. Adrian told himself that his interest was merely practical, that a man had a right to know the mother of his heir was in good health and stable spirits, that listening to her sing was simply a way of monitoring her condition without the awkwardness of direct inquiry. But he knew, in the deepest chambers of his heart where truth still lived despite his attempts to bury it, that these were lies, he told himself, to justify behavior that terrified him. This need to hear her voice, this growing obsession with the woman he had tried so hard to ignore, and as February gave way to March, and Eleanor's figure began to show the clear evidence of her pregnancy, Adrian found his vigils outside the music room growing longer, his internal battle growing more desperate, torn between the safety of his silence and the dangerous, seductive pull of the connection Eleanor was offering, not to him but to their child, a connection he both envied and longed to share, though he could not yet find the courage to step from the shadows into the light. The storm arrived on a Thursday in late March, with a ferocity that seemed to match the turmoil brewing within Thornfield Manor's walls. The wind howling like a wounded beast as it battered the ancient stones and sent sheets of freezing rain against the window panes. And despite the weather's fury, Eleanor maintained her daily routines with a determination that bordered on stubbornness, her pregnancy now visible enough that she moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo, on one hand, often resting protectively on the swell of her belly as she navigated the manor's corridors. Adrian found himself watching her more openly now, no longer bothering to hide in doorways or behind curtains, though she seemed not to notice his observation, so absorbed was she in her own world of gentle purpose, and on this particular storm-racked morning he witnessed something that would lodge itself in his chest like a splinter working its way toward his heart. Eleanor had been descending the main staircase when young Mary, a housemaid no more than 16, came rushing around the corner with an armload of linens, too hastily, too carelessly, and the inevitable collision sent the girl sprawling, porcelain dishes that had been balanced atop the linens crashing to the marble floor in an explosion of sound that echoed through the entrance hall like cannon fire, and Adrian watched from the landing above as Mary began to sob, her face crumpling in terror as she scrambled to gather the shattered pieces, clearly expecting dismissal or worse, for broken china meant money lost, and mistakes at Thornfield had never been treated with mercy. What happened next made Adrian's breath catch in his throat, for Eleanor, despite her condition, despite the treacherous footing created by scattered shards, carefully lowered herself to her knees beside the weeping girl, her movements slow and awkward with the weight she carried, and she placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder, speaking in a voice too soft for Adrian to hear the words but clear enough in its tone of comfort and reassurance. And together the two women, Duchess and servant, picked up the broken pieces while Eleanor continued her stream of soothing words, at one point even coaxing a tremulous smile from the girl. Adrian stood frozen on the landing, watching as Eleanor helped Mary to her feet, as she insisted the girl not worry about the dishes, as she sent her off with a pat on the arm and words that were obviously kind forgiveness. And only after Mary had hurried away did Eleanor allow herself a small grimace of discomfort as she pressed one hand to her lower back, the other to her belly, steadying herself before continuing her interrupted journey down the stairs. In that moment, watching his wife's quiet kindness toward a servant who had every reason to fear punishment, Adrian felt something crack within him, a fissure opening in the frozen wasteland of his heart, for he realized with stunning clarity that Eleanor's gentleness was not weakness or naivety, but rather a strength he had never possessed, a courage to remain soft in a hard world, to offer grace where judgment would have been easier, and the realization forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth that in his determination to protect himself from pain, he had become the very thing he most despised, cold and cruel, and inflicting suffering on someone who deserved none of it. And for the first time since Cassandra's betrayal had turned his heart to stone, Adrian felt shame, hot and acidic, burning away at the justifications he had built like a fortress around his conscience. That night, sleep eluded Adrian entirely, and he found himself pacing the corridors of Thornfield Manor like a restless spirit, his footsteps echoing against marble floors as the grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed midnight, then 1, then 2, marking the hours of his torment with relentless precision, and perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the growing weight of shame that had settled upon his chest since witnessing Eleanor's kindness to young Mary. But Adrian's feet carried him unbidden down the west corridor toward the music room, drawn there by a force he no longer had the strength to resist, and as he approached, he heard it, the sound that had been haunting his dreams and waking hours alike, Eleanor's voice rising in song, achingly beautiful in the stillness of the sleeping house. He stopped outside the door, which stood slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of golden lamplight to spill into the darkened hallway, and through the gap he could see her, his wife, seated at the pianoforte with her back partially turned to him, one hand resting on the keys though she was not playing, the other hand curved protectively over the swell of her belly, which was now unmistakably round beneath the soft fabric of her dressing gown, and she was singing a lullaby he had never heard before, the melody haunting and sweet, the words speaking of love unconditional and eternal, promises made to a child not yet born, but already cherished beyond measure. Adrian stood transfixed, his heart hammering against his ribs as Eleanor sang of how she would keep her baby safe from all harm, how she would teach the child to laugh and love and see beauty in the world, how loneliness would never touch this life she carried, because a mother's love would be shelter enough against any storm, and in her voice Adrian heard not only devotion but also loneliness, a profound isolation that mirrored his own, for she sang as a woman who knew what it meant to be alone, even in a house full of people, who understood that silence could be its own form of suffering, and yet despite her pain, despite the coldness with which he had treated her, Eleanor's voice remained gentle, full of hope, promising their child a warmth she herself had been denied. The song spoke of teaching the baby to sing, of filling their days with music and joy, of creating happiness from whatever materials life provided, and Adrian realized with stunning force that Eleanor was promising their child she would be both mother and father, that she would provide all the love this baby would need because she expected nothing from him, had learned to expect nothing, had accepted that she would raise their child in the emotional winter he had created, and the realization was a knife to his heart, for he heard in her words both fierce strength and quiet resignation, the determination of a woman who had been broken but refused to shatter completely, who would transform her own suffering into protection for the innocent life depending upon her. As the lullaby drew to a close, Eleanor's voice breaking slightly on the final note, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to her belly, whispering words too soft for Adrian to hear but clearly tender, clearly loving, and he watched as tears slipped down her cheeks, catching the lamplight as they fell, evidence of the pain she carried with such dignity, the loneliness she transformed into songs of hope, and Adrian felt something fundamental shift within him, the ice around his heart beginning to crack in earnest now, fissures spreading like lightning across frozen glass, and he knew, standing there in the shadows outside the music room, that he had reached a precipice, that he could no longer maintain the distance he had created, and that Eleanor's gentle persistence and fierce maternal love had finally broken through the walls he had built, and the choice before him was simple and terrifying: to step forward into the light or retreat forever into the darkness of his own making, to risk his heart again or condemn them all to a lifetime of isolation. And as Eleanor began another lullaby, her voice thick with tears but still singing, still offering love to their child despite everything, Adrian found himself unable to move, frozen between fear and longing, listening to the sound that was slowly, inexorably, calling him back to life. The decision came upon Adrian not as a rational choice, but as an irresistible compulsion, his hand moving to push open the music room door before his mind could construct the walls of fear that had kept him imprisoned for so long, and the hinges creaked softly, the sound cutting through Eleanor's lullaby like a blade through silk, and she stopped mid-phrase, her head turning sharply toward the entrance, her eyes widening with shock as she saw him standing there in the doorway. This husband, who had been a phantom presence in her life, a cold statue she passed in corridors, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other across the expanse of the music room, the lamplight casting dancing shadows on the walls, while the grandfather clock in the distant hallway marked the seconds of their silence with relentless precision, and Adrian saw the fear flicker across Eleanor's face, quickly masked but not quickly enough, the instinctive wariness of someone who had learned to expect nothing and therefore could not be disappointed. And the sight of that fear, the knowledge that she was afraid of him, her own husband, sent a fresh wave of shame crashing through his chest. He tried to speak, his lips parting, but no words came, his throat constricted by months of enforced silence and years of practiced emotional distance, and he stood there struggling like a man who had forgotten the very mechanics of human speech, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, while Eleanor watched him with those wide eyes, one hand still resting protectively on her belly as though shielding their child from whatever storm might be about to break. And Adrian felt the terrible weight of all his cruelty pressing down upon him, every ignored greeting, every cold dismissal, every moment he had chosen ice over humanity, now accumulated into a burden he could barely stand beneath. The word, when it finally came, emerged as barely more than a rasp, rough and unpracticed, his voice strange even to his own ears after months of speaking only when absolutely necessary and never to her, never to Eleanor, and he managed only 2 words, inadequate and halting but representing everything he had to offer in this moment of terrifying vulnerability. "Continue," he whispered, and then, with tremendous effort, as though each syllable cost him something precious, "Please." The tears that had been threatening at the corners of Eleanor's eyes now spilled freely down her cheeks, catching the lamplight as they traced paths along her face, and she stared at him as though he were an apparition, something impossible made manifest, and Adrian could see her hands trembling where they rested, one on the pianoforte and one on her belly, and he realized she was afraid to believe this was real, afraid to hope that the silence between them might finally be breaking, and the knowledge that he had reduced her to this state, that his own wife could not trust even this small gesture, made him want to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness for sins he was only now beginning to fully comprehend. But Eleanor, his Eleanor, demonstrated once again the strength that had sustained her through months of isolation, and after a moment's hesitation, she drew in a shaking breath and began to sing again, her voice wavering at first, but growing stronger with each note, the lullaby resuming its gentle melody. And Adrian, unable to support his own weight any longer, moved into the room on unsteady legs and lowered himself into a chair near the door, as far from her as the space would allow, not daring to come closer, not yet, but close enough to hear every word, every nuance of emotion in her voice as she sang to their child, and he listened with his eyes closed and his hands gripping the arms of the chair as though anchoring himself to something solid, while the world he had so carefully constructed began to crumble around him, and the walls he had built from bitterness and betrayal proving no match for the simple, devastating beauty of Eleanor's voice, singing of love and hope and promises to a child who would, if Adrian could find the courage, have a father worthy of such devotion. The following evening, as the clock struck 8 and the household settled into its customary quiet, Adrian found himself once again standing outside the music room, his heart beating with an unfamiliar mixture of anticipation and trepidation, and when he pushed open the door, Eleanor looked up from the pianoforte with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something softer, something that might have been hope, though she quickly looked away, as though afraid to presume too much, and he entered without speaking, settling into the same chair he had occupied the previous night, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor began to sing, her voice tentative at first but gaining strength as the lullaby unfolded, and Adrian listened with his eyes closed, and thus began a pattern that would repeat itself each evening for the next several weeks. Adrian appearing at the music room door as punctually as if summoned by bells, Eleanor offering her songs while he sat in silence, no words exchanged between them, but his presence itself, a form of communication, an acknowledgement that something had shifted in the frozen landscape of their marriage, however subtle, however fragile. The servants noticed, of course, for servants always notice such things, and Adrian caught Mary whispering to one of the footmen in the corridor, saw the meaningful glances exchanged between the cook and the butler when he passed through the dining room, and Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper whose wisdom came from decades of observing the intimate dramas of the aristocracy, wore a smile of quiet satisfaction whenever she encountered Eleanor in the hallways, and once, when Adrian passed her on the stairs, she had the audacity to give him an approving nod, as though he were a student who had finally grasped a lesson she had been trying to teach him for months, and he found he could not even summon irritation at her presumption, for there was truth in her knowing look, truth in the idea that he was indeed learning something, relearning something he had forgotten in the years since Cassandra's betrayal, the simple but profound knowledge that human connection, while dangerous, was also necessary, that walls built to keep out pain also kept out every possibility of joy. Eleanor, for her part, began to relax into these evening rituals, her shoulders no longer tensing quite so visibly when he entered, her voice growing more confident as the nights passed, and sometimes, when a particular phrase of melody moved her, she would close her eyes and lose herself completely in the song, forgetting his presence entirely. And those were the moments Adrian treasured most, when he could observe her unguarded, see the pure love that animated her features when she sang to their child. And he began to understand that what he was witnessing was not performance but prayer, Eleanor's songs a form of devotion, a way of pouring all the love she had been denied the opportunity to give him into the small life growing within her. And the realization was both humbling and devastating, for he saw clearly now how much he had wasted, how much warmth he had rejected, how cruelly he had punished Eleanor for crimes committed by another woman in another lifetime. As February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring began to touch the gardens of Thornfield Manor, the snow melting to reveal earth that had been frozen for months, Adrian noticed changes beyond their evening meetings, small shifts in the household's atmosphere that suggested transformation, the servants moving with lighter steps, more laughter echoing from the kitchens, flowers appearing in vases throughout the house, though he had given no such order. And he understood that these changes emanated from Eleanor, from her gradual emergence from the isolation he had imposed upon her, from her growing confidence that perhaps, just perhaps, the winter of their marriage might not be permanent. And Mrs. Brennan, emboldened by the thaw she observed, began speaking to Adrian more freely, mentioning in passing how well Eleanor looked, despite her advancing pregnancy, how kind she had been to the staff, how the entire household had come to love her in the months she had lived among them. And Adrian listened to these observations with something approaching shame, realizing that his wife had built a family among the servants of Thornfield Manor because he had denied her one with him, that she had found warmth in the kitchens and gardens because the chambers of her own husband remained cold and locked against her, and yet she had done this without complaint, without bitterness, transforming her exile into community, her loneliness into connection with those whom society would have deemed beneath her notice. And Adrian found himself thinking, as he sat evening after evening listening to her sing, that Eleanor possessed a strength he had never recognized, a grace that shamed his own cowardice, and slowly and imperceptibly at first, but with gathering momentum, his heart began to thaw like the frozen ground outside, responding to the persistent warmth of her presence, to the gentle but inexorable force of her patient, uncomplaining love. The words came on a Tuesday evening in mid-March, when the last traces of winter's snow had finally surrendered to spring's insistent warmth, and Eleanor sat in the music room with her hands resting on her belly, watching the sunset paint the windows in shades of amber and rose, and Adrian entered as he had done every evening for weeks now. But this time, instead of settling immediately into his customary chair, he paused near the pianoforte, his fingers brushing the polished wood with an uncertainty that made him appear almost boyish, despite the grey threading through his dark hair. And Eleanor looked up at him with those patient eyes that had witnessed so much silence and somehow not grown bitter. And he cleared his throat once, twice, struggling against years of practiced emotional constriction before finally managing to ask, his voice rusty with disuse in anything approaching genuine conversation, "The child, does he move often?" And the question hung in the air between them, so simple and yet representing a chasm crossed, a wall breached, and Eleanor's eyes widened with surprise that quickly transformed into something warmer, something that made Adrian's chest constrict with an emotion he could not quite name. "She moves constantly," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but steady, and Adrian noted the gentle correction, the way she had already assigned their child a gender in her mind, has already built a relationship with this small being he had barely allowed himself to acknowledge, and Eleanor continued, her hands moving in unconscious circles over her belly, "especially in the evenings, and when I sing to her, she seems to dance. I can feel her responding to the music." And there was wonder in Eleanor's voice, a joy so pure it made Adrian ashamed of how much he had missed, how many months he had wasted in stubborn silence, while this miracle unfolded, mere rooms away from his self-imposed exile. He found himself moving closer, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand, and asked, the words emerging more easily now, as though each syllable spoken loosened the grip of silence just a little more, "What do you imagine she will be like, our daughter?" And Eleanor smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face, and reminded Adrian that she was barely 23 years old, that he had married a young woman full of dreams and systematically ignored her until those dreams had no choice but to turn inward, toward the child who could not reject her love. And she spoke of hopes for their daughter, of teaching her music and kindness, of walks in the garden and stories by the fire, painting a picture of a future that Adrian had not allowed himself to imagine, and he listened with an intensity that surprised them both, asking questions that led to more questions, and before either of them quite realized it, they had been talking for nearly an hour. The longest conversation of their marriage, awkward and halting but real, substantive, human. When Eleanor finally grew tired and needed to rest, Adrian found himself saying, almost without conscious thought, "Tomorrow, if the weather holds, perhaps you would allow me to accompany you on your morning walk," and the invitation emerged stiffly, formally, as though he were requesting an audience with a dignitary rather than asking to spend time with his own wife. But Eleanor's face illuminated with such unguarded happiness that Adrian felt something crack further in the frozen chambers of his heart, and she accepted with a grace that made him wonder, not for the first time, what he had done to deserve her patience, her persistent, quiet dignity in the face of his cruelty. And as he helped her rise from the pianoforte bench, his hand steadying her elbow with a gentleness that felt foreign to his touch, he found himself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, it was not too late to become the husband she deserved, the father their daughter would need. And when he left the music room that evening, he did not retreat immediately to his study as had been his habit for so many months, but instead stood in the corridor outside Eleanor's chambers, listening to her soft movements within, and felt the stirrings of something he had thought dead within him, something that might, given time and courage, grow into love. Their morning walks became daily rituals over the following week, Eleanor and Adrian pacing the garden paths in careful proximity, speaking of safe topics at first, the weather and the progress of spring flowers and the estate business that required his attention. But on the 8th morning, when they paused beside the fountain where ice still clung to the stone edges despite the warming air, Eleanor surprised them both by asking, her voice quiet but steady with determination, "Will you tell me about her, about your first wife?" And Adrian felt his entire body stiffen as though struck, his first instinct to retreat behind the walls that had protected him for so long, to offer some cutting remark that would remind Eleanor of the boundaries she was transgressing. But when he looked at her face, he saw no prurient curiosity there, no desire to wound or judge, only a gentle earnestness that suggested she asked not to satisfy gossip but to understand, to know the man she had married. and after a long moment, during which he considered fleeing back to the safety of his study, he found himself instead beginning to speak, haltingly at first, his voice rough with emotion he had buried for years. He told her about Cassandra, about the whirlwind courtship that had seemed like destiny, the beautiful daughter of an earl who had chosen him despite offers from wealthier, more titled men, and how flattered he had been, how blindly he had loved her, and then the gradual revelation of her true nature, the affairs she barely bothered to hide, the mocking laughter when he confronted her, the way she had told him he was too serious, too cold, that no woman could love a man carved from ice, and how those words had burrowed deep into his soul, convincing him that the fault was his, that his very nature precluded the possibility of genuine love. And when Cassandra had died in a carriage accident while traveling to meet her latest lover, Adrian had felt not grief, but a terrible relief, followed by crushing guilt, and he had vowed then never to open himself to such humiliation again, never to give anyone the power to make him feel so utterly worthless. And so when the arrangements had been made for him to marry Eleanor, he had determined to keep her at a distance, to never allow vulnerability, and to protect himself, even if it meant condemning them both to a loveless existence. And as he spoke, Adrian realized he was confessing not just the facts of his past, but the ugliness of his own cowardice, the way he had punished Eleanor for crimes she had never committed. And when he finally fell silent, spent and raw, he could not bring himself to look at her, certain he would see disgust or pity in her eyes. But Eleanor did not speak immediately, and when she finally did, her voice carried an understanding that humbled him, for she said, "I know something of what it means to be made to feel unworthy of love." And she told him of her own childhood, of a mother who had died when Eleanor was barely 6, leaving her in the care of a father who saw her only as a commodity to be traded for financial security, who had never once asked what she wanted or dreamed of, who had arranged her marriage to Adrian without consulting her wishes, and how she had arrived at Thornfield Manor, hoping against hope that perhaps here she might find companionship, understanding, maybe even affection, only to discover that her husband had locked his heart so thoroughly that no key seemed capable of opening it. And yet she had not allowed bitterness to consume her, had instead poured her capacity for love into the child she carried, determined that their daughter would never doubt she was cherished, would never feel the cold isolation that had defined Eleanor's own life. And as Adrian listened to her quiet confession, he understood that they had both been wounded, both carried scars. But where he had responded by building walls, Eleanor had somehow maintained her capacity for tenderness, her ability to hope, and the contrast between her courage and his cowardice struck him with devastating clarity. They stood together beside the fountain as the morning sun climbed higher, and Adrian found himself reaching for Eleanor's hand, an awkward gesture made clumsy by months of practiced distance, but she allowed it, her fingers curling tentatively around his, and he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have been unfair to you, unforgivably so." And Eleanor squeezed his hand gently and replied, "We have both been lonely, but perhaps we need not remain so." And in that moment, standing in the garden with spring awakening around them, and Eleanor's hand warm in his own, Adrian felt the first true stirrings of connection, not the passionate infatuation that had doomed his first marriage, but something quieter, deeper, built on shared pain and mutual understanding. And though he knew they had far to travel before they could call what existed between them love, he allowed himself, for the first time since Eleanor had arrived at Thornfield Manor, to believe that such a journey might be possible, that the walls he had built might yet be dismantled, that the ice around his heart might eventually thaw completely. And when they turned to walk back toward the house, they did so side by side, their hands still joined. And Adrian thought that perhaps this small gesture of connection, this willingness to be vulnerable, was the beginning of something that might, given time and patience and courage, transform them both. The days that followed their conversation in the garden unfurled with a tenderness that neither Adrian nor Eleanor had anticipated, as though their shared confessions had unlocked something that could not be sealed away again, and Adrian found himself seeking Eleanor's company with an eagerness that would have bewildered the man he had been mere weeks ago, joining her not just for their morning walks, but appearing in the library when she read, in the conservatory when she tended the early spring flowers, drawn to her presence like a plant reaching toward sunlight after a long winter. And their conversations deepened, moving beyond the careful pleasantries that had marked their earlier exchanges to discussions of poetry and philosophy, of childhood memories both cherished and painful, of dreams they had harbored and disappointments they had endured. And Eleanor discovered that beneath Adrian's frozen exterior lay a mind of considerable depth and surprising gentleness, a man who could quote Wordsworth from memory and who possessed strong opinions about agricultural reform and who worried about the welfare of his tenants with a concern that contradicted his reputation for coldness, while Adrian found himself captivated by Eleanor's quiet wisdom, the way she could find beauty in small moments, her observations about human nature that revealed a perceptiveness he had not expected. And one evening in the music room, as Eleanor played a Mozart sonata with her swollen belly, making it difficult to reach the keys comfortably, Adrian approached and asked, his voice still carrying traces of uncertainty, "May I?" And when Eleanor nodded, surprised and pleased, he placed his hand gently on the curve of her abdomen, and the baby kicked against his palm with such vigor that Adrian gasped, his eyes widening with wonder, and he looked at Eleanor with an expression of such naked vulnerability that she felt tears spring to her eyes, and he whispered, "She is real. She is truly real," as though until that moment the child had been merely an abstract concept rather than a living being. His daughter, part of him and part of Eleanor, a miracle born of a union he had tried so hard to keep empty of meaning. And Eleanor covered his hand with her own and said softly, "She knows her father's touch." And Adrian felt something break open in his chest, a flood of emotion he could no longer contain or deny. Love and fear and fierce protectiveness all mingled together, and he knelt beside Eleanor's chair, his forehead resting against her belly, and Eleanor's hand moved to his hair, stroking it gently as he struggled to master himself. And in the weeks that followed, Adrian began to demonstrate his care in small but unmistakable ways, ensuring that Eleanor's favorite shawl was always draped over her chair in the drawing room, ordering the cook to prepare the lemon cakes she favored, despite her claim that she did not wish to be any trouble, arranging for additional cushions to be brought to every room she frequented so that she might be comfortable, and when he noticed her wince as she climbed the stairs, he began offering his arm without being asked, supporting her weight with a solicitude that made the servants exchange knowing glances, and Mrs. Brennan smile her approval, and Eleanor, who had spent so many months starved for any sign of warmth from her husband, found herself blooming under this attention, her smiles coming more easily, her laughter returning, and she began to see in Adrian not the cold man who had ignored her for months, but the wounded soul beneath, a man capable of great tenderness who had simply forgotten how to express it, who had convinced himself that feeling nothing was safer than risking pain, and she understood that his transformation was not instantaneous conversion, but rather a gradual thawing, each small gesture of care a crack in the ice, each conversation a step toward connection. And she met his efforts with her own gentle patience, never demanding more than he could give, accepting each offering of tenderness as the precious thing it was, and in this way, through accumulated moments of vulnerability and care, through shared fears about the coming child and growing comfort in each other's presence, Adrian and Eleanor began to build something neither had believed possible when Eleanor first arrived at Thornfield Manor as a bride to a silent stranger. They began to build not just the architecture of a functional marriage, but the foundation of genuine affection. And though the word love remained unspoken between them, it hovered in the air like a promise, waiting for the courage to claim it. As Eleanor's pregnancy entered its final weeks, her body grew heavy with the weight of the child she carried, her movements slowed by fatigue and the physical discomfort that came with bearing new life, and she found herself spending longer hours in the drawing room, resting on the chaise longue that Adrian had moved there specifically for her comfort, surrounding her with cushions and ensuring the fire was always kept burning warmly. And it was during these quiet evenings, as twilight descended over Thornfield Manor and the lamps were lit against the gathering darkness, that Adrian began a new ritual that touched Eleanor's heart with its unexpected tenderness, for he would arrive in the drawing room after dinner, carrying whatever book he was currently reading, settling into the chair beside her chaise, and he would read aloud, his deep voice filling the comfortable silence with poetry and prose, with novels of adventure and volumes of philosophy, and Eleanor would lie there listening, her hands resting on her swollen belly, feeling their daughter move and kick in response to the sound of her father's voice. and sometimes Eleanor would drift into a light doze, lulled by Adrian's reading, only to wake and find him still there, still reading, his presence a quiet promise of constancy that she had never dared to hope for during those early months of isolation. And one evening, as he read from a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, Adrian's voice faltered mid-line, and Eleanor opened her eyes to find him staring at the book in his hands, his expression troubled. And when she asked gently what was wrong, he closed the book and set it aside, and after a long moment of internal struggle, he said in a voice thick with emotion, "I am terrified, Eleanor, terrified that I will fail her, fail our daughter, that I will be to her what my own father was to me, cold and distant and incapable of showing affection." And he told her then about his childhood at Thornfield Manor, about a father who had viewed displays of emotion as weakness, who had raised Adrian with rigid discipline and icy disapproval, who had never once told his son he was loved or valued, who had died when Adrian was 19 without ever having embraced him, and Adrian feared that this coldness was somehow hereditary, that despite his desire to be different, he would inevitably repeat the pattern, condemning his own child to the same loveless upbringing that had shaped him into the frozen man Eleanor had married. And Eleanor listened to this confession with a heart that ached for the lonely boy Adrian had been, and she reached out and took his hand, drawing it to rest on her belly where their daughter moved beneath his palm. And she said with quiet conviction, "You are not your father, Adrian. You have already proven that by the care you show me, by the way you speak to our child even now, by your very fear of failing her, for a man who could not love would not worry about such things." And she told him that she had seen his transformation over these past weeks, had witnessed his capacity for tenderness that he had buried so deeply, and she believed with all her heart that he would be a wonderful father, that their daughter would grow up knowing she was cherished. And as Eleanor spoke these words of reassurance, Adrian felt something break inside him, all the guilt and shame and self-loathing that he had carried for months, the knowledge of how cruelly he had treated this gentle woman who deserved only kindness, and he slid from his chair to kneel beside her chaise, and he said, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face unchecked, "Eleanor, forgive me, please forgive me for the pain I have caused you, for the months I left you alone and afraid, for my cowardice and my cruelty. I have no right to ask it of you, but I am asking nonetheless." And Eleanor reached out and drew him close, her arms wrapping around him as he wept against her shoulder, and she whispered, "I forgive you, I forgive you." And they held each other there in the lamplight, their first true embrace, and Eleanor felt Adrian's arms tighten around her carefully, mindful of her condition, and she knew that this moment marked a crossing of some invisible threshold, that whatever walls had stood between them were finally, truly falling. And when Adrian finally pulled back, his eyes red, but his expression lighter than she had ever seen it, he cupped her face in his hands and said, "I do not deserve you, but I swear to you, Eleanor, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your forgiveness, of your patience, of you." And Eleanor smiled through her own tears and replied, "Then we shall learn together how to be husband and wife, how to be parents, how to build the life we both deserve." And Adrian nodded and pressed a kiss to her forehead, tender and reverent, and in that gesture Eleanor felt the promise of all the love they would share, all the healing yet to come. Eleanor's labor began in the dark hours before dawn, a gentle ache in her lower back that gradually intensified into waves of pain that took her breath away, and she woke Adrian, who had taken to sleeping in the adjoining chamber so he might be near her in these final days, and his face went pale with fear when he saw her doubled over, gripping the bedpost, but he masked his terror and sent immediately for the midwife and the physician, and as the household erupted into controlled chaos, servants rushing to prepare the birthing chamber with hot water and linens, Adrian returned to Eleanor's side and took her hand, and when Mrs. Brennan arrived and gently suggested that his Grace might prefer to wait in his study, as was customary for gentlemen during such delicate matters, Adrian's response was firm and brooked no argument. "I will not leave my wife." And so he remained as the hours stretched on, and Eleanor's labor grew more difficult, the baby refusing to turn properly, and Eleanor's strength began to wane as the pain became almost unbearable, and Adrian sat beside her through it all, holding her hand, wiping her brow with cool cloths, whispering words of encouragement even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him, for he could see the concern in the midwife's eyes, could hear the physician's quiet conversations about complications, and he thought he might go mad with the terror of losing her, this woman who had become more precious to him than his own life. And he leaned close to Eleanor during a brief respite between contractions and said, his voice breaking, "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Eleanor. You can do this. I believe in you." And Eleanor, exhausted and frightened, drew strength from his presence, from the love she saw shining in his eyes. And when the final stages of labor came and the physician barked instructions and the midwife guided Eleanor through the pushing, Adrian's hand was crushed in her grip, but he never once pulled away, never once left her side. And then suddenly there was a sound that changed everything, the thin wail of a newborn crying, and the midwife was saying, "A girl, Your Grace, a healthy girl." And Adrian watched through tears as his daughter was cleaned and wrapped in soft blankets. This tiny, perfect creature, with Eleanor's delicate features and a shock of dark hair, and when the baby was placed in Eleanor's arms, both of them weeping with relief and joy, Adrian leaned over them both and his family, and he looked at Eleanor's exhausted but radiant face and said the words he had been too afraid to speak until this moment. "I love you, Eleanor. I love you with all my heart. I think I have loved you since I first heard you singing to our daughter, but I was too much a coward to admit it." And Eleanor reached up with her free hand to touch his face, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she whispered, "I love you too, Adrian. I have loved you despite everything. Through all the silence and distance, I loved the man I hoped you could become, and you have exceeded every hope." And Adrian kissed her then, gently, reverently, and then he looked down at their daughter, who had stopped crying and was gazing up with dark blue eyes, and he carefully took the baby in his arms, this fragile miracle, and he wept openly, unashamed, all his walls finally and completely shattered by the overwhelming force of love he felt for this child and for the woman who had given her life. And Mrs. Brennan, watching from the doorway, smiled through her own tears at the transformation she had witnessed, for the silent Duke was silent no more, and Thornfield Manor had been reborn along with the child in his arms. The early weeks of Catherine's life brought a transformation to Thornfield Manor that the servants would speak of for years to come, for the cold, silent halls that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the soft cries of an infant and the gentle murmur of devoted parents. And Adrian, who had spent so many years locked away in solitude, now seemed unable to bear even a moment's separation from his wife and daughter, and he would appear in the nursery at all hours, drawn there by some invisible thread, and Eleanor would find him standing over Catherine's cradle, simply watching her sleep with an expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. And at night, when the baby woke crying, it was often Adrian who rose first, lifting Catherine with a tenderness that belied his large hands, and he would walk the nursery floor with her, singing the lullabies Eleanor had taught him in a soft, slightly off-key voice that nevertheless soothed their daughter back to sleep. And Eleanor would watch from the doorway, her heart so full it ached, seeing this man who had once been unable to speak a single word to her, now whispering promises of love and protection to their child. And during the day, as Eleanor recovered her strength, Adrian would bring Catherine to her for feeding, and he would sit beside them, his hand resting on Eleanor's shoulder, and they would talk quietly about everything and nothing, about their hopes for their daughter's future, about the books they were reading, about the changes they wanted to make to the manor, and gradually, through these shared moments of caring for their child, Adrian and Eleanor fell deeply, irrevocably in love, the kind of love built not on passionate declarations, but on the quiet intimacy of midnight feedings and shared exhaustion and the profound bond of creating life together. And the manor itself seemed to respond to this change, for Eleanor ordered the heavy drapes open to let in light, and she filled the rooms with flowers from the conservatory, and the music room, once dusty and abandoned, became the heart of their home. And each afternoon Eleanor would play the piano while Adrian sat nearby with Catherine in his arms, and the baby would watch her mother's hands on the keys with fascinated eyes, already drawn to music as her mother was, and the servants, who had grown accustomed to moving through the manor in hushed, fearful silence, now found themselves smiling as they worked, for they could hear laughter coming from the family wing, could see His Grace walking the gardens with her Grace on his arm, and the baby bundled in his other. They could witness the small gestures of affection between the Duke and Duchess, the way he would tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she would rest her hand on his chest when they spoke. And Mrs. Brennan, who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years and had never seen the manor so full of life, would often pause in her duties to offer a prayer of gratitude for the gentle woman who had accomplished what seemed impossible, who had melted the ice around Adrian's heart, not through force but through patience and quiet grace. And as spring turned to summer and Catherine grew from a tiny newborn into a plump, smiling infant who reached for her father's face with chubby hands and cooed at her mother's singing, Adrian would sometimes catch himself wondering at the miracle of it all, at how close he had come to destroying any chance of happiness through his own stubborn pain. And he would pull Eleanor close and whisper his gratitude into her hair, and she would smile and remind him that they had both found their way home, together, and that was all that mattered now. 5 years had passed since that transformative spring when Catherine was born, and Thornfield Manor on this golden autumn afternoon bore no resemblance to the cold, silent mausoleum it had once been, for the halls now echoed with the laughter and running footsteps of 3 children. Catherine, now a bright-eyed girl of 5, with her mother's gentle nature and her father's dark hair, followed by Thomas, a boisterous 3-year-old with Adrian's serious expression that would suddenly break into the most infectious grin, and little Margaret, barely 18 months old, who had only recently learned to walk and toddled after her older siblings with determined steps. And the music room, once dusty and abandoned, had become the heart of their family life, and on this particular afternoon, as the late sunlight streamed through the now spotless windows and illuminated the polished piano, Adrian sat at the instrument with Margaret on his lap, her tiny hands reaching for the keys while he played a simple melody, and Eleanor stood beside them, her voice lifting in song, the same lullabies she had once sung in loneliness now shared in joy. And Catherine danced in circles on the carpet, her small feet keeping time with the music, while Thomas spun until he grew dizzy and collapsed in giggles, and Adrian looked up at Eleanor as he played, and the love in his eyes was so evident that it seemed to fill the room with warmth, and she smiled back at him with such contentment that anyone watching would never believe this was the same couple who had spent their first months of marriage in painful silence. And when the song ended, Catherine climbed onto her father's other knee and demanded, "Tell us the story again, Papa, about how you and Mama fell in love." And Adrian exchanged a glance with Eleanor, that private communication that long-married couples share, and he said, "Your mother saved me, little one, with her patience and her music and her gentle heart. She took a broken man and taught him how to love again." And Eleanor came to sit beside them on the piano bench, Thomas scrambling into her lap, and she added softly, "And your father taught me that even the coldest winter eventually gives way to spring, that healing is possible if we are brave enough to try." And the children, too young to fully understand, but sensing the depth of emotion in their parents' words, snuggled closer, and later, after the children had been fed and bathed and tucked into their beds with kisses and stories, Adrian and Eleanor stood together in the music room, her head resting on his shoulder, his arms wrapped around her waist, and they looked out at the gardens that Eleanor had transformed from overgrown wilderness into beauty. And Adrian said quietly, "I think of the man I was when you first came here, Eleanor, and I can scarcely believe he was me. I was so determined to remain locked in my pain, so convinced that solitude was safer than vulnerability." And Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek with infinite tenderness, and she replied, "That man is gone, Adrian, and in his place stands the husband I always hoped for, the father our children adore, and the man who fills our home with love and laughter." And he kissed her then, deeply, and with the passion that had grown between them over the years, and the manor that had once been a prison of silence had become a sanctuary of joy, every room holding memories of their growing love, every corner transformed by Eleanor's gentle presence and Adrian's complete devotion. And as night fell over Thornfield and the last light faded from the sky, the manor glowed with warmth from within, a beacon of hope and healing, proof that even the most damaged hearts can be made whole again through patience, understanding, and the transformative power of love. Dear listener, as we close the story of Adrian and Eleanor, let us pause to consider the profound truth that lies at its heart. For theirs is not merely a tale of romance, but a meditation on the extraordinary power of patience of gentle persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable walls. And we have witnessed how a man who seemed beyond redemption, locked in the prison of his own pain and betrayal, was brought back to life, not through force or demands, but through the quiet constancy of a woman who refused to harden her own heart in response to his coldness. And this teaches us something vital about the human capacity for transformation, that even the most damaged souls can be made whole again if given time and tenderness and the space to heal at their own pace. And Eleanor's gift to Adrian was not her music, though that was the key that first unlocked his heart. Nor was it her beauty or her grace, but rather her willingness to continue being fully human in the face of his inhumanity, to maintain her kindness when met with cruelty, to sing of love even when surrounded by silence, to hope even when hope seemed foolish. And in doing so, she created a space where healing became possible, where the walls Adrian had built so carefully around his heart could slowly, brick by brick, come down. And this reminds us that we must never judge too harshly those who seem cold or distant or unreachable, for we cannot know what wounds they carry, what betrayals have taught them that vulnerability is dangerous, what pain has convinced them that solitude is safer than connection. And perhaps in your own life there are people who seem as unreachable as Adrian once was, people whose walls are high and whose defenses are strong, and while you cannot force their transformation, you can choose, as Eleanor did, to remain gentle in your persistence, to offer warmth without demanding it be returned, and to see the wounded soul beneath the ice, and to believe in the possibility of spring even in the deepest winter. And remember, too, that transformation is rarely dramatic, that it happens not in grand gestures, but in accumulated moments, in a hand slowly extended, in a word carefully spoken, in presence maintained even when met with absence, and that healing follows its own timeline, refusing to be rushed, requiring patience from both the wounded and those who love them. And as you go forward from this story, may you carry with you the understanding that love is sometimes a quiet revolution, that redemption is always possible, that the coldest hearts can be warmed, that silence can give way to song, that winter always, eventually, yields to spring. And may you find the courage to be gentle with those who seem undeserving of gentleness, to be patient with those who test your patience, to believe in transformation, even when all evidence suggests it is impossible. And may your own walls, whatever they may be, come down in time, and may you know the joy of both giving and receiving the kind of love that heals, that transforms, that makes whole what was broken. And may you rest well tonight, dear listener, knowing that no heart is too damaged to be mended, no soul too lost to find its way home. And if you have found meaning in this story, share it with those who might need to hear it, for we all know someone building walls, we all carry wounds that need gentle tending, and together, through stories like these, we remind each other that hope endures, that love conquers, and that patience prevails, and that every ending can become a new beginning if we are brave enough to believe it so. And may peace find you tonight, may your dreams be gentle, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed faith in the transformative power of persistence, kindness, and love. Brought to you with gratitude from Stories of the Heart, where every tale reminds us of our shared humanity and our infinite capacity for healing.